We live in the aftermath of the spiritual A-bomb, which was the sexual revolution.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like if we lived in a post-apocalyptic landscape, as we're used to seeing on sci-fi movies,
Yeah.
our pain and our desires and our frustrations would make a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, we live in this myth where everything's in order and everything's still going the way it always has gone.
Yeah.
And yet, men and women have been so devastated by the sexual revolution, by promiscuity, by divorce, and we're all hurting. That's why when people complain about annulments being like Catholic divorces and how there's so many today, I'm like, but wouldn't that, I mean, sure, I'm not denying that maybe that could be abused, but wouldn't that stand to reason that if we've been so wounded by the sexual revolution that a lot of people are entering marriage not knowing what they were committing to? What do you think?
Yeah, because what marriage will do is it'll bring your faults to the surface like oil and water. And sometimes faults that are only present in a seminal form at the beginning of a marriage become extremely painfully obvious as the years go on. Because in order to enter into a sacramental bond, canon law says you have to be able to fulfill the essential obligations of marriage, of things such as full giving of self, of
That's
trust, of
interesting.
loyalty.
I used to say things like, you have to know what marriage is and what you're consenting to, but I didn't realize it was more specific than that. You have to not only know what marriage is,
but have a capacity to fulfill it. And if I don't, due to trauma or other things that disable my ability to make a gift of myself, because to me, your freedom is best measured by your capacity to love. Anything that impedes my ability to give and receive love, it's to that extent that I'm not free. And so whether it's severe mental health stuff or other things going on, some of these can be to such a degree that they can make a marriage null. And so when we've got all of this going on, what we need to do is beef up our marriage prep program so that it's not just triage, like a last-ditch effort to evangelize some cohabiting couples 4 months before they tie the knot. I mean, the church teaches, Pope Francis said, marriage preparation begins at birth. And so the church has always taught marriage prep needs to be immediate, pre-cana, proximate, and remote. And so what I'm doing with like high school chastity talks, it's kind of like remote marriage preparation, where it needs to start right now instead of like, oh, we're getting married in a couple months, because people spend more time getting ready for the wedding than they do for their marriage.
Yeah. Yeah, man, it's a brutal time. I mean, do you think though that, I guess, would you say that the church has a right to regulate the marriages of its citizens, and so a person seeking an annulment can trust that? Because people talk about the abuse of annulments, and I presume that obviously can happen.
Yeah, it can, and it does happen. But in the same respect, people look at annulments as like, wow, this is just a church and the tribunal just standing like an inquisition over your life, and it's such a violating experience. I have a friend who went through the annulment process, and he said it was the most healing thing that he's experienced.
Wow.
Because in his marriage, he was subjected to so much infidelity and gaslighting and stuff, and just so much self-doubt, and to be able to lay everything before the church. And he said the final document that the church gave was so prayerfully written and theologically sound.
Wow.
It gave him such peace of heart to embark on a new life, instead of always wondering, am I a bad man if I've always craved marriage but felt like I've never actually had it. And so we need to see our church as a mother, not as an inquisitor.
I like that. But then what do you say to people? Because I mean, everyone hits rough patches in marriage.
Yeah.
I remember a time in my marriage where my wife and I got into this argument, and it was scary. I could kind of, I remember having this feeling like, okay, this isn't unbreakable. And I never thought that. And it was about 10 years in, and I'm like, oh, I could break this.
Yeah.
And that scared the hell out of me.
Yeah.
So what do you say to couples when they're going through a rough patch? And sometimes it's really, really rough. Like you're dealing with the wounds of childhood that you've never looked at. Maybe a child dies and the husband or mother becomes an alcoholic. And so how do you kind of counsel someone not to just assume, well, maybe I could take the easy way out and just look for an annulment instead of working through it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, just like the church does, the church presumes the validity of all the marriages. So that's the presumption, is that it's valid. And it needs to be significantly proved that it's otherwise with plenty of evidence and witnesses. And so the validity is just always presumed. That's where the church is beginning from. But in terms of the struggles that they're going through, a couple things that I would consider is, one is to try to obviously go to counseling. and to realize that incompatibility is a part of every marriage. I do talks for engaged couples. I used to in San Diego, and they'd have all these, couples sitting there and they're little, okay, we got to sit through this class today or whatever. And I said, to get started, I'm going to just give you all a compatibility test. It works with 100% accuracy. And you will know within the next 30 seconds if you are compatible with your fiance or not. And, you see them, they're kind of getting nervous and like, oh boy, like it's coming down right now. And I said, okay, I'm going to administer the test right now. And so you need to look to your left, look to your right. Are you a man, or is she a woman? Okay, you're incompatible. There you go. And I said, it's just, every marriage comes to the point where the incompatibility becomes painfully obvious. And then the question is, okay, well, what do we do with this? Well, obviously you go to counseling. And like, let's say we go to counseling for a year, 2 years, 5 years. Okay, nothing's changing. Do we get spiritual direction? Let's get a priest to weigh in. What's going on here? Because if you look at any president or prime minister, they surround themselves with a cabinet of advisors that give them advice on foreign diplomacy, economic affairs, military intelligence. And if they know how to listen, well, they'll govern wisely. But if they're full of hubris and like, I don't need anybody's, they'll just drive the nation into ruin. Same thing, I think, in a marital relationship, to be able to find a solid spiritual director, a really solid Catholic counselor, to be able to lay these things out and being like, okay, is this like a deal breaker? Or am I being gaslit into think that, my reaction to the problem is the problem? Or do we really have perhaps a fatal flaw that was present from the beginning?
Yeah. And it's important for those who are just watching this who don't really know a lot about what we're talking about, that an annulment is a declaration by the church that no marriage ever took place.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a divorce in Catholic language.
Yeah. It's as if they went into the church as two single people and they left the church as two single people.
Yeah.
And so the annulment is predominantly looking at the wedding day. What was going on there? Were these people free to enter into this union? Was one already in another marriage? Well, very clear, not a valid union. Was one person coerced? Was one person in the dark because they were being lied to by the other spouse? Well, how can you freely consent if you don't even know what you're consenting to?
Yeah.
And so there's a whole number of factors canon law kind of goes through to evaluate these things. And it's a long process. It takes typically well over a year for a lot of these things to go through.
Is the annulment process a new thing in the church, or has this existed since the beginning?
Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew talks about if you divorce and marry another, you commit adultery unless the marriage was unlawful. And so a lot of people don't realize that Jesus is alluding to the fact that some things that appear to be marriages are not marriage. So for the time of the Jews back then, that context had to do with levels of consanguinity within marriage, meaning how close of a relative can I marry and that still be a real marriage. And so he was pointing out that the pagans would intermarry with close relations, whereas Christians would not recognize that as a valid marriage. And so he's just pointing out that not everything that looks like a marriage is a marriage. And if it's not truly a valid marriage, then you are free to enter into what is a marriage for the first time. So you're not remarrying. Divorce sacramentally doesn't even exist. The question is, well, God has joined, no one must separate. But the question is, did God join this couple, or did they simply join themselves?
Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.